Welcome back. We've gotten a lot of questions from you during the break, and we're going to start off with them now, but please feel free to continue to send questions in. You'll see the numbers up on the screen to send questions in by telephone at 1-888-288-6736. You can also send questions in by fax and by email. The first question we get goes to you. No, I take it back. It's going to go to you, Larry, and this is has to do with the types of sources and controls that are going to be targeted for non-attainment area SIPs. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, with the previous NAAQS, the sources that we looked at were 5 tons and above. There were pretty large sources. Here we're going to be looking at some of the same types of sources, but we're recommending that states actually start looking at sources that are half a ton and above. In terms of the implementation for the SIPs that will have to be produced for the non-attainment areas, we believe that the sources that will most likely need to be controlled to bring areas into attainment are still those larger sources, but in some cases you may have the larger sources mixed in with some of the smaller sources that are at or below a half a ton per year of emissions. And so I think states, even though we've set the threshold level for emissions inventory reporting and rack-on-rack threshold for rack-on-rack analysis, we believe that states should look at sources that are at that 5.5 tons per year, but also look at some of those sources that are below that level.
Okay. And as a reminder, I'm joined this afternoon by the speakers you heard earlier, Dr. Larry Wallace, Lou Weinstock, and Dr. Deirdre Murphy. And Deirdre, the next question is for you, and it's one that on its face appears to be a simple one. When will the standards take effect?
Right. The effective date for the new standards is January 12 next year, 2009.
And that's important because that is a date that other dates key off of, correct? Larry, I believe you were saying earlier that date is what then sets the SIP due dates.
Exactly. Everything in terms of implementation is geared off of the effective date for the standard. And so states will have to make their recommendations to EPA for the non-attainment areas within a year of promulgation and the effective date of promulgation. And the dates for submittal of SIPs and the dates for when states have to attain the standards is all keyed off of that.
Thank you. Lou, we got a question in by email for you, again, having to do with deadlines. When do the new lead monitors have to be deployed?
There are actually 2 deadlines, Allison. The source-oriented monitors need to be deployed by January 1st, 2010. The non-source-oriented monitors need to be deployed a year later, January 1st, 2011. It's also important to note that annual monitoring network plans that states submit to their regions for each of those networks are due 6 months ahead of time. So the first deadline coming up is July 1st, 2009 for the source-oriented monitors, and then a year later, July 1st, 2010 for the non-source monitors.
Okay, if you'll stick with me here for a minute, we got a question in from Missouri, mentioning source-oriented, as a matter of fact. What was the basis for setting the source-oriented monitoring threshold at a ton per year?
We did a lot of analysis both in the proposal and for the final rule, looking for a balance between the size of sources where presumptively we would require monitors to the expected impact of the NAAQS. The 1 ton level was chosen as the most appropriate level to require minimum monitoring that would then result in a likely violation of the NAAQS. It's important to note, though, that in the rule itself that states are required to monitor at any source where either it's expected to or has in the past has exceeded the NAAQS. The 1 ton limit is important for states to start looking at those sources for required monitoring, but it doesn't mean that states don't need to look at those smaller sources as well.
Okay, thank you. Deirdre, this next question also by email it has to do with children's health again, which is obviously your area of expertise. As levels of lead in the air have declined so much over the past 30 years, and there are still other sources like old lead paint out there, does EPA really expect the revised air standard to reduce children's blood lead levels?
Yes. EPA has a variety of programs to address lead in children's blood. And we expect the revised air standard to be of particular benefit to those children who get their largest exposure from air sources. And this will likely be those children living in areas near sources of lead to the atmosphere where the concentrations of lead in the air are exceeding the new standard.
Okay, thank you. Lou, I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of monitoring questions today, the way things are looking here. This question has to do with dispersion modeling and says, does my state have to conduct dispersion modeling in order to determine where to site new lead monitors?
That's an excellent question. Even though the rule per se doesn't require dispersion modeling, because the monitors, particularly for the near source aspect of the network, have to be placed in maximum concentration locations. In other words, the spot around a source where a monitor would record the highest value. Dispersion modeling really is the quantitative way of evaluating that. So although the rule talks about modeling in various aspects, in fact, from a practical sense, we think modeling is required in nearly all of the near source monitors, if not for the non-near source as well.
Okay, thank you. As a reminder, please continue to send questions in. You can send them by email to open@doa.nc.gov, and you can call in or you can send questions in by fax. Larry, this next question is for you, and it has to do with state implementation plans. Are all states required to submit SIPs to address the Section 110A1 lead infrastructure requirements?
Allison, yes, they are. And as a matter of fact, it's a pretty good question. One of the things that states need to understand is that the requirement for the 110A SIP submittals are to address the infrastructure-related type requirements such as monitoring, modeling, and making sure that you have appropriate resources to implement the standards. And so basically, the requirements is basically everything that's needed in order to implement any new or revised NACs. And the 110A1 requirements don't really have anything to do with whether an area is non-attainment or not, and every state has to have one.
Okay, thank you very much. We were talking about dispersion a minute ago. Deirdre, this question is addressed to you, but you or Lou, whoever wants to take it, talk to us about how far lead travels in the air from where it's emitted.
Right. Well, lead is generally emitted into the air in the form of particles, and while very small particles can travel great distances, particles that are generally emitted from the largest sources of lead today are of a size that are not transported very far. And as Lou said, and he can add to this, that's why we are requiring these monitors be near the sources. Isn't that right, Lou?
And of course, every monitor stands on its own. Every source stands on its own in terms of the stack characteristics, the sources of fugitive emissions of lead, the topography, the meteorology of an area. So in fact, that's how modeling comes into play, because every source may look the same, but because of the different play of these characteristics, the actual point of maximum impact for one source may be very close, maybe on the street across from the plant. And in fact, for another facility, it might be a block or several blocks or hundreds of meters away. So for that reason, dispersion modeling really guides the state to make sure that the monitor is in exactly the right place.
Thank you. That's very helpful. A question in from the Iowa DNR about actual samplers. And the question is, how do I know if I can use a particular brand or model of high-vol sampler to perform lead TSP analysis?
The high-vol sampler is a very interesting case because it's probably our oldest federal reference method. And I'm sure the people in Iowa and nationwide know that for all the more recent monitors, whether for gases or for particulate measurement, we have very well specified architecture of the sampler, different kinds of technical characteristics. The high-vol sampler itself really dates from almost the 1960s and 1970s. So my first response would be that the monitor itself is the vendor, the manufacturer, portrays it as being EPA approved. If there's a sticker that comes along with it that says it's EPA approved, then it would probably be okay. But in fact, within our Part 50, there are appendices that describe the high-vol in detail. If the monitor itself fits that description, because again it's such an old method, my sense would be it's going to be suitable to use for TSP.
Okay, thank you. And we have one more question from Iowa, and that is, what is the process required to get a laboratory certified to perform lead analysis?
At least in the air world, for criteria pollutants, we don't actually certify labs per se. The key things is that the lab must use a federally approved method, either a federal reference method or a federal equivalent method. And we, together with the Office of Research and Development, have the details on what these methods are, and there are many choices, particularly for TSP. If the lab follows the actual method and the QA that the state does, as well as EPA provides, independently verifies that the method is performing, that, in essence, is the certification that the method is working okay and is appropriate. But we don't actually provide an independent lab certification that perhaps they do in the world of water monitoring.
Okay, thank you. As we anticipated, we are getting a lot of questions about monitoring, and we'll come back to Lou in a minute. Next, though, we have a question for you, Larry. And states have to submit designation requirements no later than 1 year after promulgation of this standard. Will the states have any other opportunities to comment on the agency's final designation decisions?
Yes, they will. Following the state's submittal of their recommendations to EPA, the states will have at least, or EPA has to provide them at least 120 days for response in the event where we are changing anything related to the state's recommendations. And so, and all during the process, there will be communication between EPA and the states.
Okay, great, thank you. Deirdre, this next question is for you. The agency's made mention a number of times about the fact that this tightening of the standard is the first revision in 30 years. Has the agency previously considered revising the 1978 standards?
Yes, the agency conducted a review in the mid-'80s till around 1990. There was an assessment of the science available at that time and a production of a staff paper, an OAQPS staff paper. But at that time, there was a decision not to go forward with a revision to the standard. And then since then, this is our next review of the standard, what we've just completed now.
And this new standard is 10 times tighter than the previous one,
yes,
correct?
Yes, an order of magnitude lower,
All
10
right.
times less, that's right.
Thank you. Lou, let's take some more monitoring questions here. This one comes in from Minnesota. The Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee had recommended using PM10 monitoring if the standard was less than 0.2 micrograms per cubic meter. Why did EPA decide to use TSP with the standard, which is 0.15?
Now, in fact, it's important to note that in the final rule that EPA did allow PM10 monitoring under various options. But we are looking for sites where the concentration is less than 0.10 micrograms per cubic meter. I think there are various opinions that KSAC expressed during the process, and a lot of what we heard was that if the standard was set at 0.10 or less, that PM10 would be okay as the exclusive indicator. But there was a lot of concern, I think this was mentioned by KSAC as well as our own scientists, that for many sources, the lead content in the ultra-coarse particles, those particles greater than PM10, is really critical. And that's very important, particularly in these near-source sources, near-source monitoring sites where we expect to see violations. For that reason, the agency really thought that it was the appropriate thing to require the lead TSP as the presumptive method and as the indicator for lead. But because of the flexibility that KSAC expressed and the states did in terms of having different monitoring options, I think we've allowed PM10 in a number of cases that states can talk with their EPA regions where it's appropriate to do that. But because of this concern of the ultra-coarse lead particles as well as the potential re-entrainment later on, I think the agency felt strongly that TSP was the appropriate indicator for lead.
Okay, thank you. Let's shift now from source-oriented monitors and talk about population-oriented monitors. We've got a question in from Ventura County, California, asking whether the agency will issue any guidance for siting population-oriented monitors, especially in relation to local airports.
We expect to do that, in fact, for the range of important issues that support monitoring, which includes emissions, modeling, monitoring, network design, methods, quality assurance. Sometime in the next month after the holidays, we expect to have short lists of questions and answers that I think states will find useful for guiding their efforts for deploying these monitors. The rule itself has a list of types of sources that we're interested in from the fugitive standpoint for where these non-source monitors should go. Airports, roadways, construction sites, areas of demolition and construction, hazardous waste sites. We're looking for monitoring locations within these populated areas that also have an exposure to these potential fugitive emissions of lead. Airports could be one of the sources. I think our more recent emission estimates have shown that perhaps airports are not as a critical source of lead as some of these other sources, but yes, we'll definitely in early January be issuing these kinds of Q&As and technical support that states, I think, will help them guide toward deploying these networks.
Okay. Let's give Lou a little break here for a minute and turn back to Larry. This question has to do with transitioning from the old standard to the new one. How many current non-attainment areas will be, let me start this again, how many current lead areas are still designated as non-attainment and will be required to keep the old 1978 standard in place?
Right now there are only 2 areas. One is Helena, Montana, and the other one is Herculaneum, Missouri. And those will be the only 2 areas that will remain, the old standard will remain in place until the state submits a new SIP which addresses the new standard.
So they will keep the old standard in place until until the SIP is approved. Is that correct?
Right. The SIP will the standard will stay in place until a new SIP is submitted to address the new standard, and EPA has to approve that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Deirdre, a question for you. Considering we've talked about the various sources of lead, what other steps has the agency taken to reduce levels of lead in children's blood?
Over the years, EPA has taken a number of steps. They've set new drinking water standards, standards on the management of municipal and hazardous waste, and recently, just in, I believe it was March of this year, we set standards for requirements for contractors that are doing renovation or repair or painting work in schools and certain buildings that are built before 1978, and that's intended to reduce the potential for lead-based paint hazard to cause harm to children that have access to those areas.
Let's talk now about adults. We have a question in from Washington, D.C. Are adults vulnerable to health effects in lead non-attainment areas? Or what does, let's translating it, what can lead exposure mean for adults?
For adults, yes. There are certainly effects for adults, and they include cardiovascular effects. I think we talked about that earlier. Cardiovascular effects, effects on the renal system, and so those are important effects for adults, particularly for adults that are exposed throughout their lifetime. But yes, we find that that's an important critical effect for lead, and we considered that in considering the review of the lead standard, but we felt that if we focused predominantly on children, that we would also be protective of adults.
Okay, thank you. As a reminder, you still have time to get questions in. You can send them in by email at open@doa.nc.gov, or you can fax them in to area code 919-715-3569. You can also telephone. The number is 1-888-288-6736. Lou, let's go back to some more monitoring questions here. This one comes in from Tampa, Florida. If you have a situation where there is an existing monitor that has shown a violation in the past, do you move the monitor if the maximum concentration based on modeling shows it needs to be moved?
That's a very good question. My initial sense would be the monitor should stay. I think we would, as an agency, want to be very careful about moving any monitor that has shown a violation. In terms of actually attaining the NAAQS, the monitor in a new location would have to stay there at least 3 years to show that you were meeting the new NAAQS. So I'm not clear in that question, was it the revised NAAQS or the old one?
Well, if it says shown a violation in the past, I would guess that it probably is the old standard.
If that was the case, then of course there's a likelihood that it's going to exceed the revised NAAQS since we've strengthened it by a factor of 10. I would think very hard about moving that monitor. In fact, if there's a likelihood that there's another maximum concentration point, the agency might think about establishing another monitor. You know, we certainly in this network want to focus in on areas where there's a potential to violate the NAAQS. And given the expensive lead monitoring, we realize it's a burden on agencies to have multiple monitors, but clearly there are cases where that's indicated. This sounds like this may be one of those cases where additional monitors on top of the already violating monitor would be appropriate.
And I'm sure that you or your staff are available to discuss this further later on if needed.
Certainly, and Tampa should dialogue with Region 4,
okay.
But of course will be brought in as appropriate to help discuss the situation.
Terrific, thank you. Let's go back to dispersion modeling now. This question comes in from Colorado. Which dispersion models will be required to determine the maximum concentration grid cell near lead sources, and what size grids should be used?
Although I'm not a modeler, I believe AirMod is the model of choice, but I think everyone should look forward to the guidance and the Q&A documents that we'll be issuing early in January. Across OAQPS, we have teams of emission experts, modeling, as well as monitoring per se, and we're working together. We realize that in the lead network design, it's somewhat unique that we're crossing all these disciplines. So we're pulling in expertise from all these different areas. There are certainly modelers on our team, and as we put out network design guidance, anything specific that will be helpful to people doing modeling or talking to modelers in their agencies, we will have that information out in early January.
Okay. And to the person from Colorado who submitted this question, we will make sure we pass this on to our modeling staff so that they can get back with you with any further information. We do have your email address. Lou, the next question comes in from New Mexico, and it says, we have no lead sources. However, we will be caught up by the MSA greater than 500,000 population criteria. If we start a TSP monitor and run it for a couple of years with no significant lead findings, is there a process by which we could then shut the monitor down?
The non-near source monitoring option does not have any kind of waiver provision. In other words, for the source-oriented monitors, for instance, a state could demonstrate through modeling and get a waiver of the monitoring going through the regional administrator. For the non-near source monitors, no matter what the level is, the choice would be TSP versus PM10. In most cases, we would expect PM10. The non-source monitors are really the long-term backbone of the lead surveillance network. We always have to look forward to the next review. 5 years from now, presumably, we'll be looking at this lead NACS again, and who's to say what new science may show. If we don't require a long-term backbone network, then we may not have that information we need away from sources to determine if further tightening may be necessary in the future.
Okay. Larry, this next question comes in from Florida, and we'll throw this one to you. And it's about unclassifiable areas. Is it unclassifiable going to be an acceptable category for much of the country?
Yes, it is. I mean, the monitoring network for lead has been very, very sparse over the years, and that's basically due to the fact that we have revised the standard in a lot of years. So in cases where there are no lead monitors and, more importantly, not very many lead sources that could cause a violation, then unclassifiable will be an acceptable classification.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Lou, back to you again with more monitoring questions, and actually in this case a modeling question, again from the state of Florida. Mentioning that modeling may be the best way to determine placement for the new source monitors, but the writer notes that that's not required by rule and wants to know whether the modeling is going to have to be approved by the agency before it's used.
The modeling work itself will be a dialogue between the agency and, in this case, Region 4.
Okay.
You know, whatever information we use has to be quantifiable, has to be a scientifically justifiable means, whether it's calculating emissions, doing modeling. So I think in any sense, I don't know that a region will necessarily replicate all these models like they may do in some other kinds of enforcement cases. But I think the use of modeling consistent with the guidance that we put out would go a long way to demonstrating that the method was appropriate or not. But all the information that backs up why a state decided to put a monitor in a particular case, will have to be submitted along with the annual monitoring network plan.
Okay.
So in a sense, the specifics of what the state proposes for lead monitoring will be in the plan. It would be our expectation that the methods used and certainly references to where the public or the regional administrator, if they wanted to follow up on how was that maximum location identified, would be able to determine what method the state used to find that maximum location.
All right. We have a couple more questions from Florida. The next one has to do with determining which sources have emissions of 1 ton a year or more. And the question's fairly simple. What is the rounding convention for determining whether a source requires monitoring?
In the rule itself, we say 1.0 tons or more. We don't have data handling guidance for that particular number the way we do, for instance, in how to report.
Okay.
So I wouldn't necessarily read more into that unless one of our emissions specialists tells us. You know, of course, we acknowledge that there's certain uncertainties in emission estimates. You know, so in terms of how far to the right of a decimal place the actual emission estimate in the NEI, for instance, for lead can go, you know, maybe for others to say what's reasonable or not. You know, we're of course very specific in how data should be reported to AQS in terms of how we actually compute design values for determining attainment. So I think states really have to work with their emission specialists and know how far to the right is meaningful and how far to the right is simple noise and rounding error in determining when they should actually look for monitoring. But I should add that the 1.0 ton number, remember, is not a hard and fast limit. That's kind of a presumptive limit that guides states to where they should be looking for sources. But in fact, they need to model or look at any source that has the potential or history for violating the NAAQS. That could be a 0.9 ton source, a 0.8. Again, as we've talked about the configuration. So I don't think we should be hung up on the decimal place as much as evaluating all the sources near a ton and making sure, if anything, we're a little bit conservative and model more of them than less of them.
Okay. Thank you very much.